Sydney Baker stood at the counter, her hands steady while her face was not. A bruise bloomed beneath a silk scarf, purple and swollen, a secret she was expected to carry with a smile. The night before, her husband's fist had landed without warning. Now the smell of coffee filled the air like nothing had happened. Mark Baker walked in, glanced at her face, then casually dropped his wedding ring into the sink. "Don't start," he said flatly. "Just be normal." Sydney placed the plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, coffee, perfect. As she slid it closer, something thin rested beneath the dish, barely noticeable, deliberately placed. Mark smirked, unaware. He thought this breakfast meant obedience. He had no idea it was the beginning of his end. Before we begin the story, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're drawn to powerful stories about justice, quiet strength, and women who rise without begging, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. From the outside, the Bakers looked ordinary, respectable, even enviable. The kind of couple neighbors pointed to as proof that hard work and love eventually settled into something stable. Mark Baker played his role flawlessly. He held doors open in public, remembered birthdays, shook hands firmly, smiled at the right moments. At company dinners, he spoke about his wife with practiced affection, calling her incredible and selfless, as if those words were medals he had personally pinned to her chest. Sydney Baker stood beside him in those moments, composed and quiet, her posture perfect. She nodded when he spoke. She smiled when others laughed. No one noticed how she measured her breath or how her eyes scanned rooms for exits. No one saw the cost of that calm. Inside the house, Mark's voice changed. It wasn't loud at first. It never needed to be. Control, Sydney learned early on, didn't require shouting. It required repetition. Mark decided when they ate what they spent, where they went. He framed it as responsibility, as leadership, as love. "I'm just trying to protect us," he would say, checking her phone under the guise of curiosity. "You don't need all that stress. Let me handle it." Over time, Sydney stopped questioning where her paycheck went after it hit their joint account. She stopped asking why he needed her passwords. She stopped explaining herself altogether. Silence became a skill, one she refined, not out of weakness, but survival. Mark noticed everything. The minutes she came home late, the coworkers who texted too often, the days she seemed tired in ways he didn't approve of. And when he noticed, he corrected, with words sharp enough to sting but clean enough to leave no mark. "You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. You should be grateful." Sydney learned that defending herself only prolonged the lesson. So she absorbed it. She nodded. She adapted. Her friend, Lena Moore, noticed the change before anyone else. Lena had known Sydney since before the marriage, before the careful smiles and long sleeves. They met once a week when schedules allowed coffee, quick lunches, 10 minutes stolen between responsibilities. Lately, Sydney always chose seats with her back to the wall. Lately, she flinched at raised voices, even when they weren't meant for her. "You okay?" Lena asked, once studying Sydney's face with the precision of someone who spent her days reading people's hands, their posture, the tension they carried. Sydney smiled. "Just tired." Lena didn't push, not yet, but she started paying attention. At home, Mark tightened his routines. Dinner at 7, no phone at the table. Questions framed as jokes, rules framed as care. If Sydney forgot, he reminded her with a look, with a sigh, with silence that stretched long enough to suffocate. He liked that silence. He liked how it bent the room toward him. Sydney began waking earlier, carving out minutes when the house belonged only to her. In those hours, she moved quietly, efficiently, leaving no trace of resistance. She packed lunches, she washed dishes, she planned her days down to the minute. If she gave Mark nothing to criticize, there would be less reason for him to correct. Still, correction came. It always did. The first time he grabbed her wrist, he apologized immediately. The second time he blamed the day he'd had. The third time, he didn't explain at all. Each incident rewrote the rules. Each apology came with a condition. "Forget this. Don't tell anyone. Don't make it worse than it is." Sydney complied because compliance kept the peace for a while. but something inside her shifted after that last night. The bruise on her face was not the first injury. It was simply the one Mark hadn't planned for. The one that showed up in daylight, impossible to fully hide, impossible to explain away with clumsiness or coincidence. In the bathroom mirror that morning, Sydney studied it without emotion. Purple edged into yellow near her cheekbone, a clear timeline her body had recorded without permission. She touched it lightly, noting the tenderness, the heat. Mark knocked once before entering. He always knocked. A courtesy that meant nothing when followed by intrusion. "You going to work like that?" he asked, eyes flicking to her reflection. "I'll manage," Sydney said. "Make sure you do." His voice softened falsely. People talk. People had always talked, just not about the right things. Later that afternoon, while Mark was at work, Sydney sat at the kitchen table with her phone turned face down. The house felt different without him in it, lighter but also exposed. She moved carefully as if sound itself might betray her. She wrote nothing down, not yet. She simply replayed conversations in her mind, cataloging them the way she'd been trained to catalog symptoms at work. Dates, triggers, patterns. She didn't label them as abuse. She labeled them as data. That night, when Mark returned, he acted as though nothing had happened. He asked about her shift. He commented on the food. He kissed her forehead like a stamp of ownership. Sydney let him. Because for the first time, she wasn't enduring the moment, she was observing it. From that vantage point, the marriage looked less like a partnership and more like a performance Mark insisted on directing alone. He needed her quiet. He needed her predictable. He needed her small. And Sydney understood something new, something unsettling in its clarity. Mark's power depended entirely on her silence. That realization didn't make her reckless. It made her patient. She continued her routines. She smiled when expected. She spoke softly, carefully. She answered questions without volunteering information. Mark mistook this for submission. He relaxed into it, convinced he had corrected the problem. Sydney, meanwhile, began preparing not to leave, not yet, but to see clearly. She watched how Mark spoke to others, how easily he shifted masks. She listened for inconsistencies. She noticed which doors he closed and which he assumed would never open. She memorized the sound of his footsteps, the rhythm of his moods. By the time Mark poured himself a drink that night and complained about work, Sydney already knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a bad phase. This wasn't stress. This wasn't something that would fix itself. It was a system, and systems once understood could be dismantled. The night it crossed the line didn't begin with shouting. It began with silence, the heavy, watchful kind that settled over the house like a held breath. Mark came home later than usual. His jacket was still on when he set his keys down too hard on the counter metal, clanging against stone. Sydney noticed the signs immediately, the tight jaw, the clipped movements, the way his eyes skimmed past her as if she were an object placed in the wrong room. "Dinner's warm," she said calmly. He didn't answer. Mark poured himself a drink without asking if she wanted one. He took a long swallow, then another. The television stayed off. He preferred confrontation without witnesses, even imagined ones. "You embarrassed me today," he said at last. Sydney kept her voice neutral. "I wasn't with you today." At lunch, he snapped. "When my boss asked about you. You didn't respond to his email this week." She paused. "I didn't see it." Mark laughed, once sharp and humorless. "That's the problem. You don't see things. You don't think ahead." Sydney felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the warning her body always gave, before his moods tipped into something worse. She chose her words carefully. "I can reply tomorrow. That's not the point." He turned toward her, then eyes cold. "The point is that you make me look careless." There it was. Not concern, not partnership. Image. Sydney stood by the counter, hands resting flat against the surface, grounding herself. "I'm not trying to." Mark stepped closer. "Don't interrupt me." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It always had. Sydney lowered her gaze, not in submission, but calculation. She knew the rhythm of these moments. She knew when to let the wave pass. But Mark didn't stop. "You think just because you work all day, you're entitled to forget your responsibilities at home," he continued. "You think I don't notice how distracted you've been lately." She said nothing. That silence, usually enough, irritated him further. He reached for her arm, harder than before. Sydney flinched, reflexive and instant. The movement was small, but it was enough. Mark's expression changed. Something dark flickered behind his eyes. "Don't pull away from me." "I didn't," she began. The strike came fast and open-handed. Not the kind that knocked her down, the kind that was meant to shock, to correct. Her head snapped to the side, pain blooming across her cheekbone, sharp and disorienting. For a moment the room tilted. Sydney steadied herself against the counter, ears ringing, skin burning. She tasted blood where her teeth had caught the inside of her lip. Mark froze. He looked at his hand as if surprised it belonged to him. Then the switch flipped. "I didn't mean," he stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "You just got Sydney. You know how you get when you push." She raised her eyes to meet his. That was new, Mark noticed. His apology shifted, reshaped itself into something defensive. "You shouldn't have provoked me. I've had a terrible day." Anyone would have snapped. The words fell into place like a script he'd rehearsed before. Sydney said nothing. He exhaled, relieved by her silence. "I'm sorry," he added, softer now. "You know I'd never hurt you on purpose." On purpose. The phrase echoed in her head. Mark reached out, hesitated, then rested his hand on her shoulder like a claim. "We just need to be more careful. Both of us." Sydney nodded slowly. She felt oddly detached, as if she were watching the scene from outside her body. The pain in her face pulsed steadily, undeniable. This wasn't like the other times. This wasn't something she could explain away. Mark seemed to realize it too. "You're not going to make this a thing," he said quietly. Not a question. Sydney met his gaze. "No." Satisfied, he kissed her temple, avoiding the bruise already beginning to form. "Good. I can't afford distractions right now." He finished his drink and went to bed without looking back. Sydney stayed in the kitchen long after the house went still. When she finally made her way to the bathroom, she turned on the light and faced the mirror. The mark was already there, spreading, darkening. Her face told the truth even when she didn't. She leaned closer, examining it with clinical precision. Shape, color, location. She noted how it would change by morning. This wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. She remembered other moments, the grip on her wrist, the shove that had sent her stumbling into a doorframe, the words that had chipped away at her sense of self until she'd started apologizing for existing. She saw now how each incident had been a test. How much would she tolerate? How far could he go? Tonight he'd learned something. So had she. In bed, Mark slept soundly. Sydney lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing. Each inhale, each exhale felt like a countdown she hadn't known was ticking. By morning, she knew he would act as if nothing had happened. He would expect breakfast, normalcy, forgiveness without accountability. Sydney turned onto her side, careful not to wake him. She wasn't planning an escape, not yet. She wasn't planning a confrontation. She was planning documentation. The bruise throbbed as if in agreement. For the first time since their marriage began, Sydney allowed herself a thought she'd never dared voice before. This wasn't her fault. And if Mark believed one strike would silence her forever, he had made a miscalculation. Because Sydney Baker didn't need to shout to be heard. She only needed time. Morning arrived with a thin gray light, the kind that slipped through the blinds without warmth or promise. Sydney Baker woke before her alarm, her body already alert, already braced. The bruise on her face had stiffened overnight, tender and unmistakable. She moved carefully, testing her jaw, her cheek registering pain without reacting to it. Mark was still asleep. Sydney lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing. It was steady, untroubled. He slept like a man who believed the world was arranged for his comfort. She slipped out of bed without making a sound. In the bathroom, she studied her reflection again. The bruise had deepened into a dark bloom beneath her eye. No amount of makeup would erase it completely, but she wasn't trying to erase it. She wrapped a silk scarf loosely around her neck and cheek, not to hide the truth, but to control when it would be seen. The kitchen felt colder than usual. Sydney moved through it with deliberate calm. She washed her hands. She set out plates. She cracked eggs with steady fingers, careful not to rush. This was not denial. This was strategy. The coffee machine hissed softly. Toast popped up golden and precise. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Normal. She knew Mark depended on that word. Normal meant predictable. Normal meant control. Normal meant he didn't have to worry. While the eggs cooked, Sydney did 3 things quietly, efficiently, without hesitation. First, she took out her phone and photographed her face from multiple angles. She didn't wince. She didn't rush. She documented. Then she backed the images up to a secure cloud folder Mark didn't know existed, one she'd created months earlier after a training at work on data security. At the time, it had felt abstract. Now it felt essential. Second, she gathered her essentials into a tote she kept hidden beneath the sink. A spare charger, her ID, cash she'd withdrawn in small, unnoticeable amounts over time. A change of clothes, nothing dramatic, nothing that would look like an escape, just preparation. Third, she sent a single message. "Are you free today? I need you." S. She didn't add details. Lena Moore would understand the urgency and the brevity. Mark appeared in the doorway as Sydney slid eggs onto a plate. He looked rested, confident. His gaze flicked to her scarf, then away. "You're up early," he said, pouring himself coffee. "I couldn't sleep," Sydney replied evenly. He shrugged, unimpressed. "Make sure you don't burn the toast." She placed the plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, coffee, exactly how he liked it. Mark glanced at his phone and took a bite. He didn't thank her. He rarely did. As Sydney set down the second plate, he reached out and adjusted the scarf on her cheek with a careless tug. "You don't need that inside the house." She met his eyes. "I'm cold." He smirked, unconvinced, but let it go. He was already bored with the moment. His attention returned to his phone, his world narrowing back to himself. Sydney watched him eat, noting how relaxed he looked. How certain. When he finished, she slid a thin envelope beneath his plate as she cleared the table. "What's this?" he asked. "Mail," she said. "I forgot to give it to you yesterday." Mark glanced at it, uninterested, and shoved it aside. "I'll deal with it later." Sydney nodded. That was fine. She hadn't expected him to open it yet. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and kissed her cheek again, avoiding the bruise with precision. "Be normal today," he said quietly. "Don't make things harder than they need to be." The door closed behind him. Sydney stood alone in the kitchen, her pulse finally quickening. She waited until his car disappeared down the street before moving. Across the road, Mrs. Carol Whitman was watering her plants. She waved as she always did. Sydney raised a hand in return, careful to keep her scarf in place. Mrs. Whitman's eyes lingered for a moment longer than usual, sharp and assessing. Sydney wondered what she had seen or heard. She grabbed her tote, locked the door, and stepped outside. Halfway to her car, Mark's front door slammed open again. "Hey!" Sydney turned. Mark stood on the porch, keys in hand, irritation etched across his face. "You forgot to take out the trash." The timing was cruel. Perfect. Sydney nodded. "I'll do it when I get back." He sighed loudly as if burdened by her existence. "Just don't forget." As she turned away, Mark grabbed her wrist briefly, impatiently pulling her back a step. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Sydney did. Mrs. Whitman's watering hose stilled across the street. Mark released her wrist, just as quickly, unaware of the audience, unaware of the small black camera mounted beside Mrs. Whitman's front door, its lens angled perfectly toward the baker's porch. Sydney didn't react. She didn't pull away. She didn't raise her voice. She simply met Mark's eyes long enough for the moment to register. Then she got in her car and drove away. Her hands shook once she was 2 blocks down. She pulled over, breathed deeply, and forced herself to slow her thoughts. This wasn't a breakdown. It was adrenaline. At the clinic, Sydney went straight to the bathroom and removed her scarf. The fluorescent lights were unforgiving. The bruise stared back at her, undeniable now. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened her phone and checked her messages. On my way, all good. Sydney went about her shift as usual, her movements precise, her voice calm. Patients didn't ask questions. Co-workers didn't comment. Or if they noticed, they pretended not to. It was easier that way. During her lunch break, Lena arrived. She took one look at Sydney's face and didn't speak. She simply sat down across from her eyes, steady waiting. This happened last night, Sydney said quietly. Lena exhaled through her nose, controlled but furious. Did he? Yes. No embellishment, no hesitation. Lena reached across the table and covered Sydney's hand. Okay, she said. Then we do this right. Sydney nodded. I don't want drama. You won't get it, Lena promised. You'll get protection. They planned quickly, efficiently. Where Sydney would go if she needed to leave, who she would call, what she needed to document next. Lena offered her spare room without hesitation. You don't have to decide everything today, Lena said. Just don't stay alone with this. Sydney agreed. That evening, she returned home later than usual. Mark texted once, then twice, irritation creeping into his words. She replied calmly, briefly, keeping him just reassured enough. When she walked through the door, the house felt different. Mark was in the living room, drink in hand, eyes sharp. You didn't answer my call. I was busy, Sydney said. He studied her face, his jaw tightening as he noticed the bruise uncovered. People are going to see that, he said flatly. Sydney met his gaze. Yes. For the first time, he looked uncertain. That uncertainty didn't last. Go put something on it, he snapped. We don't need questions. Sydney didn't move. The silence stretched. Mark scoffed and turned away. Do whatever you want, he muttered. Just don't drag me into your moods. Sydney went to bed early that night. She lay awake listening, waiting, documenting every sound, every word. Across the street, a small red light blinked once, then went dark. The camera had done its job. And Sydney Baker, calm and deliberate, had just taken her first step out of the shadows. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee clean controlled familiar. Sydney Baker had always found comfort in places like this, where procedures mattered and facts carried weight. Today that comfort sharpened into resolve. She waited until the end of her shift. Not because she had to, but because timing mattered. She didn't want questions framed by emotion or urgency. She wanted accuracy. When the hallway finally quieted and the last patient was discharged, Sydney knocked once on the open office door at the end of the corridor. Come in, Dr. Helena Wright said, already looking up. Dr. Wright had the posture of someone who didn't waste words. Years of leadership had carved efficiency into her movements, clarity into her gaze. She took in Sydney's face in a single glance, her expression tightening not with shock, but recognition. Sit, she said calmly. Sydney closed the door behind her and did as instructed. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Dr. Wright said, "Tell me what happened." Sydney didn't dramatize. She didn't soften. She didn't apologize. Last night my husband struck me, she said evenly. This is not the first time. It is the first visible injury. Dr. Wright nodded once. Do you feel safe right now? Yes, Sydney replied. But I need this documented correctly. That earned her full attention. Then we'll do this by the book, Dr. Wright said. Every step. She stood and retrieved a clipboard, her movements precise. She examined the bruise, carefully measuring swelling, discoloration, tenderness. She asked questions in a steady voice: time of injury, mechanism, progression of symptoms. Sydney answered without hesitation. No one rushed her. No one doubted her. When it was over, Dr. Wright met her eyes. "I'm proud of you for coming forward," she said simply. "And I need you to hear this clearly. What you described is abuse, not a misunderstanding, not stress." Sydney absorbed the words without reaction. She already knew, but hearing them stated plainly mattered. "I'll finalize the report," Dr. Wright continued. "You'll have a copy. And if anyone contacts the clinic asking questions that aren't appropriate, I'll handle it." "Thank you," Sydney said. Dr. Wright hesitated, then added, "If you need time off, I don't," Sydney replied gently. "Not yet." Dr. Wright studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But my door stays open." Sydney left the office with a manila folder tucked under her arm. It wasn't thick. It didn't look dramatic, but it was solid. In the parking lot, Lena was waiting in her car engine, idling. She stepped out the moment she saw Sydney. "Did you get it?" Lena asked. Sydney held up the folder. "Yes." Lena exhaled a long breath she'd been holding since morning. "Good. Then we're doing this right." They drove in silence for a few minutes before Lena spoke again. "I talked to someone." Sydney glanced over. "Who, a lawyer?" "Ethan Cross." Sydney raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." "I didn't tell him details," Lena said. "Just enough. He said if you're ready, he'll meet you. No pressure." Sydney considered it. "Not today." "Okay." They stopped at a small cafe near Lena's shop. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet conversations and the hiss of steaming milk. Normal life happening all around them. Sydney placed the folder on the table between them. Lena didn't touch it. "You don't have to open that yet," she said. "Just knowing it's there changes things." Sydney nodded. "It does." They talked logistics, where Sydney could stay if things escalated, how to keep Mark from accessing her devices, which passwords needed changing. Lena offered her spare room again. No conditions, no timelines. "You won't be a burden," she said firmly. "You'll be safe." Sydney felt something loosen in her chest at that word. Safe. That evening, Sydney returned home at her usual time. Mark was already there, seated at the kitchen table with his laptop open, irritation radiating off him like heat. "You didn't answer my texts," he said. "I was at work," Sydney replied. He scoffed. "You're always at work." She set her bag down carefully. "You knew my schedule." Mark closed his laptop with more force than necessary. His eyes flicked to her face, uncovered now. "That still looks bad," he said. "Did you put ice on it, like I told you?" Sydney met his gaze. "I saw a doctor." The room went still. Mark's jaw tightened. "Why would you do that?" "Because I was injured." His voice dropped. "You didn't need to involve anyone." Sydney didn't raise hers. "I did." For a moment, Mark looked almost nervous. Then irritation took over. "You're overreacting," he said. "This is how things get blown out of proportion. People start making assumptions." Sydney recognized the shift. He wasn't angry about the act. He was angry about the record. "Nothing happened," he continued. "And even if something did, you know how these things look. It could hurt us. Us." Sydney thought of the folder in her bag, of the camera across the street, of the messages saved, the images archived. "I'm not discussing this," she said calmly. Mark stared at her. Since when since now? That unsettled him more than shouting ever could. He stood looming, trying to reclaim space. "You're acting strange." "I'm tired," Sydney replied. He watched her closely as she moved past him toward the bedroom. "You're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you?" She paused at the doorway and turned back. "No," she said. "I'm thinking very clearly." Mark didn't like that answer. That night, Sydney slept lightly, alert to every sound. Mark paced the house longer than usual, his irritation simmering. He didn't touch her. The next morning, Sydney woke before him again. She added one more thing to her tote, the manila folder. At work, she met with Lena during lunch. "I'm ready," Sydney said. For what, Lena asked, though she already knew. to talk to the lawyer. Lena smiled tight, but relieved. I'll call him. That afternoon, Sydney sat across from Ethan Cross in a quiet office that smelled of old books and fresh ink. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, his pen moving only when necessary. When she finished, he leaned back slightly. You did the right thing coming now, he said. And I need to be clear with you. This isn't just a personal issue. This is a legal one. Sydney nodded. I understand. We'll move carefully, Ethan continued. No confrontation, no warning shots. We document, we protect, and we let the system do its job. Sydney met his eyes. I don't want revenge. Ethan nodded once. Good. Justice works better without it. When Sydney left the office, the sky was beginning to darken. The day had been long, but something inside her felt steadier than it had in years. She wasn't free, not yet, but she wasn't invisible anymore either. And for the first time since the bruise appeared on her face, Sydney Baker knew something with certainty. She had proof. Mark Baker noticed the shift before Sydney said a word. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defiant. That was what unsettled him. The house still ran on schedule. Dinner appeared on time. The laundry was folded. Sydney spoke when spoken to and didn't raise her voice. On the surface, nothing had changed. But control was a language Mark spoke fluently, and Sydney had stopped responding in the way he expected. She no longer filled silences with explanations. She no longer rushed to smooth his moods. When he questioned her schedule, she answered once clearly and didn't elaborate. When he criticized, she acknowledged the comment without apologizing. It was subtle. It was dangerous. On the third night after her visit to the doctor, Mark came home earlier than usual. Sydney was in the kitchen chopping vegetables with measured precision. Where's your phone? He asked casually. In my bag, she replied. Let me see it. Sydney didn't freeze. She didn't rush. She set the knife down, wiped her hands, and met his gaze. Why, the word landed between them like a crack in glass. Mark smiled tightly. Don't start acting strange. You know I like to check in. Transparency, remember I'm busy, Sydney said. You can look later. His smile vanished. Later doesn't work for me. She picked up the knife again. Then it will have to. The room filled with something sharp and electric. Mark stepped closer. You think you're in a position to say no? Sydney didn't look at him. I think I'm allowed to finish cooking. That was when he understood. She wasn't scared, not the way she used to be. Mark took a step back, recalibrating. Anger wouldn't work here, not yet. He needed leverage. He found it the next morning. Sydney checked her bank app on her break and felt the floor drop out from under her. Her account balance was nearly zero. She stared at the screen, reread the numbers, refreshed the page. Same result. Her paycheck gone, transferred out in a single clean transaction. Her phone buzzed. Mark, we need to talk. Sydney closed her eyes briefly. She'd known this was coming. She just hadn't known how quickly. She didn't respond. At home that evening, Mark was waiting at the table with a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. He gestured for her to sit. We need to get practical, he said, tapping the documents. Things have been tense. I think it's time we talk about separation. Sydney sat slowly, her expression neutral. These are standard forms, Mark continued. Nothing dramatic, just something to make things easier for both of us. She picked up the top page and scanned it. Her name appeared again and again, always beneath lines that gave things up claims rights access. The language was dense, intentionally confusing. This would leave me with nothing, she said calmly. Mark shrugged. You don't need much. I'll make sure you're taken care of. I already am, Sydney replied. He leaned forward. Don't be naive. You don't have your own money right now. You don't have anywhere to go. You don't want this to turn ugly. Sydney met his eyes. You already turned it ugly. The muscle in Mark's jaw twitched. This is me being generous, he said. Sign and we can keep this private. No lawyers, no mess. Sydney set the papers down. "I won't be signing anything tonight." Mark's voice hardened. "You don't have the luxury of waiting." Sydney stood. "Then we're at an impasse." He slammed his hand on the table. "Sit down." She didn't. For a moment, Mark looked like he might grab her. The impulse flickered raw, familiar. Then he seemed to remember something. The bruise, the scarf, the way she'd said she'd seen a doctor. His hand curled into a fist at his side. "Fine," he said coldly. "Do it your way. But don't expect my help when things fall apart." Sydney nodded once. "I won't." That night, she packed her tote fully for the first time. She didn't leave yet. She wasn't ready to make a move that obvious. But she slept with her keys and phone within reach, her senses tuned to every sound. Mark didn't sleep at all. He paced. He drank. He made calls in low voices from the garage. Sydney heard fragments, money deadlines, pressure. She recognized the tone. Desperation disguised as control. The next day, her phone rang at work. "Unknown number." "Miss Baker," a man asked. "This is HR from Mark's company. We received some concerns regarding your well-being. Is everything all right at home?" Sydney's grip tightened around the phone. Mark was escalating. "Yes," she said evenly. "Everything is fine." The man hesitated. "If you'd like to speak with someone, I wouldn't," Sydney replied. "But thank you." She ended the call and immediately documented it. That afternoon, she met Ethan Cross again. "He's freezing me out financially and pushing paperwork," Sydney said. "And he's contacting people to question my stability." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. "Classic containment strategy. He's trying to rush you into signing before you build a record." "What do? We slow everything down," Ethan said. "And we protect you." He outlined the steps with precision. Separate finances immediately. Emergency orders if necessary. A formal notice instructing Mark not to contact her workplace. Preparation for a protective order if his behavior continued. "Do not sign anything," Ethan said firmly. "And do not tell him you have representation." Sydney nodded. "He's already angry." "That's fine," Ethan replied. "Anger makes people careless." That evening, Sydney didn't go home. She texted Mark, once staying with a friend. "Need space." His reply came seconds later. "You don't get to decide that." She didn't respond. At Lena's apartment, the air felt different, lighter, safer. Sydney sat on the edge of the bed Lena had made up for her, and finally allowed herself to exhale fully. "You okay?" Lena asked. "Yes," Sydney said. For the first time in a while. They ate takeout on the floor and talked quietly, planning contingencies. Lena showed her where the spare key was, where the light switches were, what the neighbors were like. Simple things, necessary things. Later that night, Mark's calls began, one after another, voicemails piling up. His tone shifted with each message from irritation to accusation to something almost pleading. Sydney listened to none of them. She saved them. Across town, Mark sat alone in the house he believed he owned, staring at unsigned papers and an empty bed. His plan had been simple: isolate, pressure, resolve. But Sydney Baker had stepped out of the box he'd built for her. And now, every move he made only tightened the record forming around him. By the time he realized that silence could work against him too, it was already too late. Sydney fell asleep in Lena's guest room with her phone charging beside her and a folder of evidence secured in her bag. She wasn't running. She was repositioning. And Mark Baker, frantic and grasping, had just revealed how much he had to lose. Ethan Cross's office was deliberately understated. No sweeping city views, no glass walls meant to impress. Just clean lines, muted colors, and shelves of neatly labeled files that suggested order could be imposed on chaos if one knew where to apply pressure. Sydney Baker sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, posture straight. She had slept better than expected at Lena's place, but the fatigue still clung to her in quieter ways. Not weakness, just the weight of vigilance. Ethan reviewed his notes without rushing. He had listened more than he spoke during their last meeting, a habit Sydney appreciated. "Before we go any further," he said, finally looking up, "I want to be clear about how this works. You don't confront him, you don't warn him, and you don't test him." Sydney nodded. "I won't." Good, Ethan replied. Because people who rely on control don't give it up cleanly. They escalate. Sydney thought of the frozen bank account, the paperwork, the call to her workplace. He already has. Yes, Ethan said, which means he's predictable. He slid a legal pad across the desk, 3 lines neatly drawn from top to bottom. This is the framework, he said. 3 layers. We build all of them at the same time. Sydney leaned forward slightly. First, Ethan continued tapping the left column, physical safety. Where you are now staying with a friend is the right move. You do not return to the house alone. You vary your routines. You let people know where you are. I've done that, Sydney said. Lena has my schedule. So does my supervisor. Good. Second layer, financial protection. Sydney's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We open a new account in your name only, Ethan said. We redirect your income immediately. Temporary orders can be filed if needed, but for now, separation is key. He doesn't get to starve you into compliance. And the money he already moved, Sydney asked. We document it, Ethan replied. Every transfer becomes part of the record. Control leaves a paper trail. People forget that. Sydney exhaled slowly. And the third layer, she asked. Ethan's tone sharpened. Legal positioning. He listed the components without drama. Medical documentation, witness statements, communication logs, video evidence. A request for a protective order filed when timing maximized impact. We don't rush that, he said. We wait until the pattern is undeniable. Sydney considered the words. He's already trying to make me look unstable. Ethan nodded, which helps us. How? Because credible abusers almost never need to discredit, Ethan said. They rely on facts. When someone jumps to character assassination early, it suggests fear. Sydney absorbed that quietly. Ethan leaned back in his chair. You said you don't want revenge. I don't, Sydney replied. Good, he said again, because revenge is loud. Justice is methodical. They spent the next hour building a timeline, not just of violence, but of behavior controlling language, financial manipulation, isolation tactics. Ethan asked precise questions. Dates, times, context. Sydney answered calmly, surprised by her own steadiness. When they finished, Ethan closed the folder. This is solid, he said. And it's just the beginning. As Sydney stood to leave, Ethan added, and one more thing. If he contacts you, you keep everything. Don't respond unless necessary. And if he shows up unannounced, call the police. Sydney nodded. I will. Outside, the afternoon light felt sharper, clearer. Lena was waiting in the car, drumming her fingers against the steering wheel. How'd it go? She asked as Sydney got in. He's building a case, Sydney said. Carefully. Lena smiled faintly. Good, because Mark's unraveling. Sydney turned. What do you mean he came by the shop today? Lena said, acting concerned. Asked if I'd noticed you acting off lately. Sydney felt a flicker of anger, but it passed quickly. And she asked. I told him you've been busy saving lives and minding your own business, Lena said. He didn't like that. Sydney nodded. He's trying to set a narrative. Too late, Lena replied. People notice patterns, and he's sloppy when he's nervous. That evening, Sydney's phone buzzed again. Mark. She stared at the screen for a long moment before opening the message. We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. She didn't respond. A minute later, another message arrived. You're making a mistake listening to other people. Sydney saved it. Then another. I can fix this if you stop. She closed the thread and set the phone face down. Later that night, she listened to the voicemails with Lena beside her. Mark's voice shifted across messages, controlled irritation, giving way to sharper edges. You're blowing this up. I'm trying to help you. Don't force me to protect myself. Sydney paused the playback. Save that one, Lena said quietly. Sydney did. The next morning, Sydney went back to work as scheduled. She kept her head down, her movements precise. Dr. Helena Wright met her in the hallway and spoke softly. If you need anything, documentation statements, let me know. "Thank you," Sydney said. At lunchtime, an unfamiliar car was parked near the clinic entrance. Her phone buzzed. "Mark, I'm outside." Sydney didn't reply. She forwarded the message to Ethan. His response came almost immediately. "Do not engage. If he approaches you, call 911. Sydney's heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady. From the window, she saw Mark pacing near the entrance phone pressed to his ear. He looked agitated, scanning faces, searching. He didn't see her. After 10 minutes, he left. Sydney documented the incident. That afternoon, Ethan filed a formal notice instructing Mark to cease contact with Sydney's workplace. It was precise, unemotional, effective. Mark responded the only way he knew how. He called Lucas Reed. Lucas had been Mark's ally for years, a co-worker who smoothed over expenses, signed off on questionable approvals, covered gaps with jokes and favors. When Mark vented, Lucas listened. "You're losing control," Lucas said flatly after Mark finished his rant. "She's manipulating the situation," Mark snapped. "I just need leverage." "You already used your leverage," Lucas replied. "And now there's a record." Mark went quiet. Meanwhile, Sydney spent her evenings quietly rebuilding the scaffolding of her life. She changed passwords. She updated beneficiaries. She created a new email address known only to Lena and Ethan. Each action was small. Each one mattered. On the fourth night at Lena's, Sydney sat on the bed and opened her notes app. She began writing, not emotions, not fears, but facts. Dates, statements, behaviors. The list grew longer than she expected. Not because things had suddenly gotten worse, but because she was finally seeing them clearly. Her phone buzzed one last time that night. "Mark, I don't recognize you anymore." Sydney typed a response, then deleted it. He didn't need to recognize her. He had never known her. Sydney lay back against the pillows, exhaustion finally catching up with her. But beneath it was something steadier, a sense of alignment, of purpose. For years, Mark Baker had dictated the rules of their marriage, convinced that silence meant compliance. Now silence meant evidence. And Sydney Baker, patient and precise, was no longer waiting for permission to be safe. She was building a case that would speak for her. Haley Brooks liked to believe she had won something. She moved through the world with the confidence of a woman who thought she had been chosen over another chosen, because she was more exciting, more desirable, more alive. When Mark Baker had started showing up for late dinners and quiet weekends under the excuse of work stress, Haley hadn't questioned the gaps in his story. She'd filled them with her own assumptions. Men like Mark didn't leave wives like Sydney for nothing, she told herself. They left because they were unappreciated, suffocated, misunderstood. Haley was certain she was the solution. She began appearing where she knew Mark would be seen. Company mixers, industry fundraisers, casual lunches near his office. Mark didn't stop her. In fact, he encouraged it subtly at first, then more openly as his control at home began to slip. "Let them see," he'd said once. "It keeps things honest." Honest to Mark meant useful. Sydney learned about Haley the way she learned everything now, quietly through observation, not confrontation. The first time she saw Haley in person was unplanned. Sydney had gone back to the house midweek, accompanied by Lena to collect some work files and clothes. They moved efficiently, avoiding rooms that held too much weight. As Sydney closed a drawer in the bedroom, she heard laughter downstairs, high, confident, unfamiliar. She froze. Lena's eyes met hers. "You want me to check?" Sydney shook her head. "I know what this is." They descended the stairs together. Mark stood in the living room with Haley beside him, one arm draped casually around her waist. Haley was polished in the way of someone who spent time curating her image, sleek, hair-sharp blazer heels that clicked with purpose. Her gaze swept over Sydney with open curiosity. Mark stiffened for a fraction of a second before recovering. "This isn't a good time," he said coolly. Sydney didn't respond to him. She looked at Haley instead. Haley smiled, not cruelly, confidently. "Oh," she said lightly, "you must be Sydney." Sydney inclined her head. "Yes, I've heard a lot about you. Haley continued. Mark talks about you all the time. Sydney doubted that, but she didn't correct her. We're just grabbing some things, Sydney said calmly. We'll be out of your way. Haley's smile tightened slightly. No need to rush. This is Mark's house, too. Sydney's eyes flicked briefly to Mark. I'm aware. Mark cleared his throat. Haley, this is his wife. Haley finished, still smiling. I know. The air shifted. Lena stepped forward, placing herself subtly between Sydney and Mark. We'll be quick. As they moved toward the stairs, Haley's voice followed them. I hope everything works out for you, she said, sweet and sharp. These things are never easy. Sydney paused and turned back. Nothing worth keeping is easy, she replied evenly. Haley blinked, momentarily thrown. They left without another word. In the car, Lena let out a breath. She's bold. She thinks she's safe, Sydney said. That makes her careless. Over the next week, Haley became more visible. She posted pictures, ambiguous angles, reflections. In restaurant windows, glasses of wine clinking across tables Mark favored. She didn't tag him, but she didn't need to. People who knew. Mark liked it. The attention fed his sense of control. If Sydney saw good, if others saw better. What he didn't see was how Haley talked when she thought she was untouchable. It happened during a charity event hosted by Mark's company, a low-pressure gathering meant to impress donors and executives alike. Sydney hadn't planned to attend. She had no reason to. But Ethan Cross had suggested otherwise. Not to confront, he'd said. To observe. Sydney went with Lena, blending easily into the crowd. She kept her distance, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. Mark noticed her almost immediately. His smile faltered, then reset. Haley noticed too. She approached Sydney with a glass of champagne, in hand, her confidence back in place. I didn't expect to see you here, Haley said pleasantly. I was invited, Sydney replied. Oh, Haley said. Of course. They stood near the edge of the room, the hum of conversation around them providing cover. You seem calm, Haley observed. Most women wouldn't be. Sydney met her gaze. Most women don't mistake noise for power. Haley laughed lightly. You sound bitter. Sydney shook her head. I sound informed. That gave Haley pause. Mark told me things have been difficult at home. Haley continued, lowering her voice. He's under a lot of pressure. Work, finances. It's impressive how much he carries. Sydney's attention sharpened. Finances. Haley waved a hand dismissively. You know, covering gaps, moving money around to keep projects afloat. Nothing unusual at his level. Sydney kept her expression unchanged. You sound well-versed. Haley smiled a little too proudly. He trusts me. That was the moment. Sydney didn't press. She didn't ask questions. She simply listened as Haley continued filling the silence with assumptions and half-truths, mentioning expenses paid through accounts that weren't meant for personal use, joking about how Mark had borrowed from one budget to impress another. Haley believed she was showing loyalty. She was revealing evidence. Sydney thanked her for the conversation and walked away, heart steady, mind racing. Later that night, she sat across from Ethan, recounting the exchange word for word. That's significant, Ethan said quietly, especially if it aligns with what we're already seeing. It will, Sydney replied. Mark's patterns are consistent. The next day, Lucas Reed called Mark in a panic. Your name is coming up in places it shouldn't, Lucas said. Expense reviews, questions. Mark swore under his breath. Handle it? I can't if it keeps escalating, Lucas replied. And your girlfriend's talking. Mark froze. She wouldn't. She already is, Lucas said. Not intentionally, but she doesn't know when to stop. Mark's grip tightened around his phone. That evening, Haley confronted him. Why didn't you tell me you were moving money like that? She asked, irritation edging her voice. I don't want to get dragged into something. Mark's patience snapped. You said you understood. I said I trusted you, Haley shot back. There's a difference. Mark stared at her, seeing not an ally, but a liability. Meanwhile, Sydney continued her routine work documentation meetings with Ethan. She didn't post. She didn't react. She let Mark and Haley fill the silence with their own missteps. One afternoon, Ethan called her. "We have enough for the next move," he said. "Between the financial inconsistencies and the pattern of control, the timing is right." Sydney closed her eyes briefly. "What happens now?" Now Ethan said we let them overreach. That night, Sydney received a message from Haley. "I think we should talk, woman to woman." Sydney stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she forwarded it to Ethan. He replied with a single line, "Say nothing." Sydney complied. Across town, Mark Baker paced his living room, anger tightening into fear. The walls felt closer than they used to. The control he'd relied on was slipping, not because Sydney had attacked him, but because she had stepped aside and let him reveal himself. And Haley, no longer certain she was winning, began to realize something unsettling. She hadn't replaced Sydney. She had been used. By the time Mark understood that every word spoken in confidence could be turned into a blade, the damage was already done. Sydney Baker hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't exposed him publicly. She had simply let the truth walk forward on its own. The petition for the protective order was filed on a Tuesday morning, not because Tuesdays carried meaning, but because timing did. Ethan Cross believed in momentum, the quiet kind, that built beneath the surface before anyone realized the ground was shifting. By the time Mark Baker heard about the filing, it wouldn't feel sudden. It would feel inevitable. Sydney Baker sat in Ethan's office as he reviewed the final documents, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. She had learned to hold still in moments that mattered. "Once this is submitted," Ethan said, tapping the stack into alignment, "there's no undoing the first impression. The court will see the pattern, not just the incident." Sydney nodded. "I understand." He looked up at her. "If the judge grants the temporary order, and based on what we have, I expect Mark will be served. That moment tends to escalate behavior." "What do I do when it does?" Sydney asked. "You document, and you don't engage." She exhaled slowly. "That's already my instinct." Ethan gave a brief nod. "Good. Then let's proceed." The filing took less than 15 minutes. The impact took seconds. Mark was served that afternoon outside his office building, just as he was stepping into the parking garage. A uniformed officer approached him with professional neutrality, handed him the papers, and explained the order in plain language. Mark's face drained of color. "You've got to be kidding me," he snapped. "This is a misunderstanding." The officer's expression didn't change. "You've been notified. You are to maintain distance and cease contact as outlined." Mark watched the officer walk away, the papers heavy in his hand. A few co-workers glanced over, curiosity flickering. Mark forced a smile, laughed it off, and climbed into his car. The smile vanished the moment the door closed. At home, Sydney received the notification from Ethan: order served. Temporary protection in place. She felt the shift in her chest immediately. Not relief, not victory, but something steadier. Acknowledgement. That evening, Mark tried to call her. The call went unanswered. He tried again, and again. Sydney didn't listen to the voicemails. She forwarded them. By the third attempt, his tone had sharpened into accusation. "You did this to punish me," he said in one message. "You're destroying everything." In another, his voice dropped, controlled and threatening. "This doesn't end well for people who lie." Sydney sat at Lena's kitchen table, phone face down, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Lena watched her carefully. "You okay?" Lena asked. "Yes," Sydney said. "He's doing exactly what Ethan said he would." The next morning, Mark went to work and found his access restricted. HR called him in before noon. Due to ongoing legal matters, the representative said cautiously, "We're placing you on administrative leave pending review." Mark stared at her. "On what grounds? We received documentation," she replied. "We're obligated to act." "What documentation?" She hesitated. "A protective order." Mark laughed, sharp and incredulous. "You can't be serious." "I am," she said. "You'll be escorted out." Word spread faster than Mark expected. By the time he reached his car, his phone was vibrating nonstop. Lucas Reed's name flashed across the screen. "What the hell is going on?" Lucas demanded the moment Mark answered. "Finance is auditing everything. Everything." "Keep them off me," Mark snapped. "That's your job." "Not anymore," Lucas replied. "I didn't sign up for domestic violence headlines." Mark's grip tightened. "You owe me." "I owe myself," Lucas said. "And I'm not going down with you." The line went dead. That night, Mark broke the order. He showed up outside Lena's apartment just after midnight. Sydney heard the knock from the bedroom, hard, insistent. Her heart rate spiked, but her movements stayed calm. She picked up her phone and called 911 before approaching the door. "Sir, you need to leave." Lena called through the door. "I just want to talk." Mark's voice came back too loud for the hour. "She can't hide behind paperwork." Sydney stepped forward, her phone still to her ear. "He's here," she told the dispatcher. "Yes, the person named in the order." Police arrived within minutes. Mark tried to explain, to charm, to reframe. The officers didn't debate. They read the order, issued a warning, and documented the violation. Sydney watched from behind the door as Mark was escorted away, his frustration spilling out in sharp gestures and raised voice. The next morning, Ethan called. "That violation strengthens our position," he said. "A lot. What's next?" Sydney asked. "Next," Ethan replied, "we make it formal." The hearing was scheduled quickly. Sydney entered the courtroom dressed simply, her posture straight, her expression composed. Mark sat across from her, jaw-tight, eyes darting. He looked smaller here, less certain, stripped of his usual stage. The judge reviewed the evidence methodically. Medical documentation, witness statements, communication logs. The video from Mrs. Carol Whitman's door camera, showing Mark grabbing Sydney's wrist and pulling her back toward the house. Mark's attorney tried to minimize it. "Stress," he said. "Misinterpretation. A private matter." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Private matters don't usually leave this much documentation." Sydney didn't speak unless asked. When she did, her answers were brief, factual. "I was struck," she said. "I sought medical care. I documented the incident. I left for my safety. No embellishment, no drama." The order was granted. When the judge read the terms, Sydney felt something loosen inside her, not because Mark was restricted, but because the truth had been named. Outside the courthouse, Mark confronted Ethan, his voice low and furious. "You think this makes you powerful?" he hissed. "You think she wins?" Ethan's tone was calm. "This isn't about winning. It's about accountability." Mark turned toward Sydney. "You'll regret this." Sydney met his eyes without flinching. "No," she said quietly. "You will." That afternoon, Sydney received a message from HR at her clinic. "We've been made aware of recent events. Your position is secure. Please let us know if you need accommodations." She read it twice. Then she smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, but real. That night, she slept through without waking once. Across town, Mark sat alone in the house he could no longer enter, without consequence, staring at walls that no longer answered to him. His calls went unanswered. His narratives fell flat. The system he'd relied on, silence, fear, isolation, had failed him. And Sydney Baker, protected by law and anchored in evidence, had taken another step forward. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irrevocably. The protective order changed the rules, but it didn't change Mark Baker's nature. If anything, it sharpened it. Unable to reach Sydney directly, he turned to the one arena he still believed he could control: perception. If he couldn't silence her, he would discredit her. If he couldn't dominate the facts, he would poison the story. The first sign came quietly. Sydney noticed it in the way conversations paused when she entered the break room. In the way a coworker asked too carefully whether she was feeling okay lately. In the way an administrator lingered after a routine meeting, eyes searching her face as if looking for instability. She didn't panic. She recognized the tactic. Mark had begun seeding doubt. It started with emails, carefully worded messages to HR, to supervisors, to mutual acquaintances. Nothing accusatory on the surface, just concern. "I'm worried about Sydney. She's been under a lot of stress. I'm afraid she's not thinking clearly." The language was deliberate, protective, plausibly kind. At the clinic, the administration requested a meeting. Sydney arrived on time, dressed professionally, her demeanor calm. Dr. Helena Wright was already there when she entered the conference room, seated beside two administrators. The sight steadied her immediately. "We wanted to check in," one of them began. "We've received information that suggests you may be going through a difficult personal situation." Sydney nodded. "That's accurate. We just want to ensure patient safety," the administrator continued. "And your well-being," Sydney met her gaze. "Of course." Dr. Wright spoke then, her voice even. "Sydney has been exemplary. There have been no incidents, no complaints, no performance issues." The administrator hesitated. "Still, given the circumstances, the documented circumstances," Dr. Wright interjected gently, "do not reflect on her competence. They reflect on her need for protection." Silence settled over the room. Sydney added quietly, "I'm happy to comply with any standard evaluation procedures, but I won't accept speculation as evidence." The administrators exchanged a glance. "That won't be necessary," one said at last. "We appreciate your transparency." The meeting ended without consequence. Outside the room, Dr. Wright touched Sydney's arm briefly. "You handled that exactly right." "Thank you," Sydney said, "for being there." "I always will be," Dr. Wright replied. "And for the record, this is what manipulation looks like. You're not imagining it." Sydney knew, but hearing it affirmed mattered. That afternoon, Ethan Cross called. "He's shifting tactics," he said. "Character attacks. Soft ones." "I expected that," Sydney replied. "Good," Ethan said, "because it means he's running out of leverage." Mark didn't stop with the clinic. He contacted Sydney's extended family, people she hadn't spoken to in months. He framed his story carefully, portraying himself as worried, confused, blindsided. "She's not herself," he told them. "I'm scared she's being influenced." Some believed him, some didn't. Sydney heard about it through second-hand messages, concerned check-ins that carried more doubt than care. Each one stung, but none surprised her. She documented them all. The next escalation was louder. Mark posted a vague message online. Nothing explicit, nothing actionable. It's heartbreaking when the person you love turns against you. Comments poured in. Sympathy, support, confusion. Sydney didn't respond. Lena, however, was furious. "He's farming pity," she said, pacing the living room. "I want to say something." Sydney shook her head. "No, that's what he wants. Then what do we do?" "We let him talk," Sydney replied. Every word adds weight to the record. Mark's need for control pushed him further. He contacted Dr. Helena Wright, directly requesting information about Sydney's mental state. Dr. Wright forwarded the email to Ethan within minutes. "This is inappropriate," she wrote simply. Ethan responded with equal precision. "Any further attempts to obtain protected health information will be documented and addressed." Mark received the warning that evening. It enraged him. He drove past Lena's apartment twice, slow and deliberate, as if reminding Sydney he still existed. She photographed the car from the window, time-stamped saved. When that didn't provoke a reaction, he tried something riskier. He filed a complaint against Sydney. The allegation claimed she was emotionally unstable, prone to exaggeration, and potentially dangerous in her role at the clinic. The complaint triggered a mandatory review. Sydney received the notice via email and read it without expression. That night, she met Ethan in his office. "He's crossed into retaliation," Ethan said. "Which is good." "Good?" Sydney asked. "Yes," he replied. "Because retaliation is provable, and it weakens his position substantially." They prepared meticulously. Dr. Wright submitted a formal statement. Co-workers provided evaluations. Sydney supplied her documentation timelines, messages, voicemails, the HR call, the workplace visit. The review concluded in less than 48 hours. The complaint was dismissed. Mark's employer was notified. That was the moment things began to collapse. Mark was called into a meeting with corporate counsel the following Monday. The questions were no longer polite. The tone was no longer neutral. "You failed to disclose ongoing legal matters," one attorney said. You violated conduct expectations, another added. And there are concerns regarding misuse of company resources. Mark denied everything. They didn't argue. They informed him of the investigation. When he left the building that day, his access badge deactivated behind him. Across town, Sydney received a message from Ethan. The pressure is working. Stay steady. She did. She continued going to work. She continued documenting. She continued refusing to engage publicly. Mark, meanwhile, spiraled. He called mutual friends desperate to explain. He tried to corner narratives that no longer responded to him. The more he spoke, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Lucas Reed stopped answering his calls entirely. Haley Brooks, once so confident, began distancing herself. Her messages to Mark grew cautious, then infrequent. "You said this was under control," she texted once. Mark didn't reply. Late one evening, Sydney sat alone in Lena's guest room, scrolling through her notes. The list had grown long, not because the situation had worsened, but because clarity had sharpened her memory. She realized something then, something she hadn't allowed herself to articulate before. Mark wasn't trying to win. He was trying to survive exposure, and the more he fought, the clearer his guilt became. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "We're ready for the next phase. Financial discovery. It's time." Sydney closed her eyes briefly. She wasn't afraid. She was ready, because she understood now that power didn't come from controlling the story. It came from standing still, while the truth did its work. Mark Baker had tried to erase her voice by questioning her sanity, her competence, her credibility. Instead, he had documented his own downfall. And Sydney Baker, steady, composed, unyielding, was no longer defending herself. She was advancing. Financial discovery did not arrive with drama. It arrived with emails, deadlines, and requests framed in neutral language that left no room for interpretation. Mark Baker received the notice on a Thursday afternoon. He stared at the subject line longer than necessary, as if disbelief might rewrite it. Request for financial disclosure. His lawyer had warned him this was coming. Mark had waved it off, then convinced he could manage it the way he managed everything else, by controlling the flow of information, by giving just enough to appear cooperative, while hiding the rest. But this time, the request was precise. Accounts, statements, transfers, business reimbursements, credit activity. Every trail he had assumed invisible was now under a spotlight. Across town, Sydney Baker sat in Ethan Cross's office, listening as he outlined the process. "This is where patterns become proof," Ethan said. "Not accusations, not suspicions, numbers." Sydney nodded. "He's careless when he's under pressure." Ethan's mouth curved slightly. "That's been my experience." They began with the obvious. Mark's personal accounts showed regular withdrawals that didn't align with household expenses. Sydney's income, once deposited faithfully, had been rerouted, then redistributed in irregular bursts. Some transfers coincided with nights Mark claimed he was working late. Others lined up with dates Haley Brooks had posted from expensive restaurants and hotels. Then came the corporate records. Mark had been careful, but not careful enough. Expense reports padded with vague descriptions. Travel reimbursements for trips that didn't correspond with company needs. Payments authorized just below thresholds that would trigger automatic review. And always Lucas Reed's name appeared beside the approvals. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "This is where it gets interesting, because it's not just personal," Sydney said. "Exactly," Ethan replied. "It's misuse." When Lucas Reed received the subpoena, he didn't sleep that night. He showed up at Ethan's office the next morning without an appointment, pale and sweating, his confidence gone. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said, pacing. "Mark said it was temporary, that he'd fix it." Ethan remained seated. "You authorized the transfers." Lucas ran a hand through his hair. "He pressured me." "Did he threaten you?" Lucas hesitated. "Not directly." "Then you chose to help Ethan," said evenly. Sydney watched silently as Lucas's bravado collapsed into calculation. "I can cooperate," Lucas said finally. I can explain how it started." Ethan nodded. That would be wise. The story unfolded quickly after that. Mark had begun dipping into discretionary funds months earlier, small amounts at first framed as short-term fixes. When no one noticed, the amounts grew. Lucas rationalized it as harmless. Mark assured him he'd reimburse everything once a deal closed. The deal never closed. Instead, the money went to maintaining appearances, dinners, gifts, hotels. A version of success Mark needed others to see, including Haley. When Haley received notice that her name appeared in the discovery material, she panicked. She called Mark repeatedly. He didn't answer. She called a lawyer of her own, who asked questions she didn't know how to answer. Did you receive gifts purchased with company funds? Were you aware the accounts weren't personal? Did you benefit from misappropriated resources? Haley's confidence cracked. She sent Mark a single message. You told me this was clean. He didn't reply. By the following week, Ethan had assembled a clear picture, one that didn't rely on Sydney's testimony at all. This stands on its own, he told her. Even if you never spoke, this would still move forward. Sydney absorbed that quietly. For so long, she had believed that telling the truth required being believed, that justice depended on persuasion. Now she understood something different. Truth didn't need her voice if it had a ledger. Mark, meanwhile, spiraled. He fired his attorney and hired another. Then another. Each one gave him the same assessment with different words. This is serious. You're exposed. You should have settled earlier. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating properly. He started drinking more. And then he made a mistake. He called Sydney, not once, not twice, 6 times in a single hour. She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she forwarded the call logs to Ethan. This is harassment, Ethan said, and it helps us. Mark left a voicemail. I know what you're doing, he said, his voice tight and shaking. You think you're smarter than me. You think you can destroy me and walk away clean. Sydney listened to it once, then she saved it. At the next meeting, Ethan slid a document across the table. Based on the evidence, we're expanding the scope, he said. Civil liability, potential criminal exposure. Sydney looked at the page. What does that mean for him? It means consequences, Ethan replied. And choices. Those choices arrived sooner than Mark expected. Corporate counsel contacted him again this time, with a different tone. We have reason to believe company funds were misused, they said. You'll need to cooperate with the investigation. Mark denied it reflexively. They didn't argue. They informed him his position was terminated, effective immediately. He hung up and stared at the wall. Across town, Sydney received an email notification. Termination notice issued. She didn't celebrate. She simply closed her laptop and went for a walk. The city felt different when she moved through it now, lighter, less threatening. She realized she was no longer scanning crowds for him, no longer bracing for impact. That evening, she met Lena for dinner. It's happening, Lena said, eyes bright. People are talking. Let them, Sydney replied. What are you feeling? Sydney considered the question. Clear. At home, Lena's home for now, Sydney opened her notebook and added one final entry to the timeline. Financial discovery initiated. Pattern confirmed. She paused, then wrote another line beneath it. Silence maintained. Mark Baker had believed power meant controlling outcomes. But he was learning too late that power also meant restraint. Sydney had shown restraint for years, mistaken for weakness, exploited without consequence. Now she wielded it deliberately. And as the system closed in around Mark, methodical, impersonal, irreversible, Sydney Baker stood exactly where she needed to be. Out of his reach, and entirely within her own. The charity gala had always been Mark Baker's stage. A polished venue downtown, soft lighting, donor lists, curated to impress, this was where he usually thrived. He knew how to work a room, how to laugh at the right volume, how to project stability even when things underneath were cracking. For years, the performance had worked. This time, it was different. Mark arrived early, dressed impeccably, shoulders squared, as if posture alone could restore authority. He told himself this night would reset the narrative. If people saw him calm, generous, intact, they would doubt the rumors. They always had. He didn't know that Sydney Baker was already there. Sydney arrived quietly, accompanied by Ethan Cross and Lena Moore. She wore a simple black dress, understated, deliberate. No dramatic makeup. No attempt to conceal anything that didn't need concealing. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there to be present. They took seats near the edge of the room, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid spectacle. Ethan leaned slightly toward her. "We don't move until the timing is right." Sydney nodded. "I understand." Across the room, Mark noticed her. The effect was immediate. His smile faltered just for a second, but it was enough. He hadn't expected her to show up. He hadn't expected her to look like this. Calm, unbothered, unafraid. He recovered quickly, turning to greet a donor, laughing too loudly at a comment that wasn't funny. His eyes kept flicking back to Sydney, searching for some sign of weakness. He found none. Haley Brooks arrived late. She scanned the room with visible tension, her confidence dulled by weeks of unanswered questions and half-truths. When she spotted Mark, relief crossed her face, followed quickly by irritation when she noticed Sydney seated nearby. Haley approached Mark, lowering her voice. "Why is she here?" Mark forced a smile. "Ignore her." "That's hard to do," Haley said tightly. "People are watching." Mark's jaw tightened. Let them. But they were watching. Whispers traveled faster than Mark realized. Not accusations, curiosity. Glances toward Sydney. Side looks toward Mark. The kind of attention that didn't flatter. The program began. Speeches, applause, polite laughter. Mark relaxed slightly as the familiar rhythm took hold. He was halfway through a conversation with a board member when he felt a presence at his side. "A process server, Mark Baker," the woman asked quietly. He stiffened. "Yes." She handed him an envelope. "You've been formally served." The words cut through the room like a dropped glass. Mark stared at the envelope as if it might dissolve. "This is inappropriate," he hissed. "You can't do this here." "It's been documented," she replied calmly. "Have a good evening." The server walked away. Mark felt the room tilt. The board member stepped back slightly, concern flickering across his face. "Is everything all right?" Mark laughed, a brittle sound. "Of course. Just a misunderstanding." But his hands were shaking. Across the room, Ethan watched carefully. Now he said softly. Sydney stood. She didn't rush. She didn't look at Mark. She walked with steady steps toward the exit, Ethan and Lena beside her. The movement drew attention not because it was dramatic, but because it was purposeful. Mark saw her then. She wasn't fleeing. She was leaving on her own terms. Something in him snapped. "Wait," he called out louder than he intended. Heads turned. Sydney paused. The room went quiet in that charged way only public spaces could manage. Mark crossed the distance between them too quickly, his voice dropping. "You planned this." Sydney met his eyes. "No," she said calmly. "You did." "This is harassment," Mark hissed. "You're humiliating me." Sydney didn't raise her voice. "I didn't choose the timing. I chose the truth." Haley stepped closer, her face pale. "What is she talking about?" Mark turned on her. "Stay out of this." Sydney looked at Haley then, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. "You might want to speak to your lawyer," Sydney said quietly. "Tonight." Haley's breath caught. About what Ethan stepped forward. Financial exposure, potential liability. The words landed hard. Haley's confidence evaporated. "Mark," she whispered. "What did you do?" Mark lashed out. "Don't start." His raised voice drew more attention. Guests stared openly now. Phones came out. Someone murmured Mark's name with concern that sounded suspiciously like judgment. A security staff member approached cautiously. "Sir, is there a problem?" Mark turned flushed and sweating. "No, there's no problem." Sydney spoke then, not loudly but clearly enough to be heard. "There is," she said. but it's being handled. That was the moment the mask slipped completely. Mark laughed, sharp and unhinged. "You think you've won," he said. "You think this makes you powerful?" Sydney met his gaze steadily. "I think this makes you accountable." Security stepped closer. Ethan placed a hand lightly on Sydney's back. "We should go." Sydney nodded. As they turned toward the exit, Mark shouted after them, "You'll regret this." Sydney stopped one last time. She didn't turn around. "I already lived the part where I regretted staying," she said calmly. "This part is just the consequences." They left the room to stunned silence. Outside, the night air felt cool and grounding. Sydney released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were steady. Her heart was calm. Lena exhaled sharply. That was something. Ethan checked his phone. That interaction was witnessed by multiple parties, he said, and recorded. Sydney nodded. Good. Inside the venue, Mark stood alone. Donors distancing themselves, whispers thick in the air. His phone buzzed incessantly, messages from colleagues, from Haley, from numbers he didn't recognize. The stage had turned into a spotlight he couldn't escape. Haley confronted him near the bar, her voice trembling. "You said this was under control." Mark didn't answer. She stepped back, realization dawning. "You lied to me." Mark's silence confirmed it. She walked away. By the time Mark left the venue, his reputation had fractured beyond repair. The performance he'd relied on for years had failed, not because Sydney had attacked him, but because she had let the truth arrive at the right moment in the right place. At Lena's apartment later that night, Sydney sat quietly, a cup of tea warming her hands. Ethan spoke first. That was the turning point. Sydney nodded. "I know. You did exactly what you needed to do," he added. "Nothing more." Sydney looked out the window, at the city lights, steady and distant. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was bracing for the next blow. She felt like the ground had finally stopped moving beneath her feet. The fallout from the gala didn't explode all at once. It fractured quietly, relentlessly through channels Mark Baker had once relied on to protect him. By Monday morning, the board of his former company had convened an emergency session. Not a discussion, a review. The kind that moved forward whether the subject cooperated or not. Mark sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, phone vibrating endlessly on the coffee table. He ignored most of the calls. He couldn't ignore the emails. Requests for clarification, notices of investigation, legal language stripped of politeness. He poured himself a drink with shaking hands. Across town, Sydney Baker walked into Ethan Cross's office carrying a slim folder. She looked rested, grounded, as if the world had shifted back into alignment around her. Ethan motioned for her to sit. "We're entering the evidentiary phase," he said. "This is where everything converges." Sydney nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing new," Ethan replied. "Just confirmation." He slid the folder across the desk. Inside were transcripts, time-stamped logs, and one particular item marked clearly at the top. Doorbell camera footage, Whitman residence. Sydney inhaled slowly. Mrs. Whitman agreed. "Yes," Ethan said. She came forward on her own. The footage played on the screen. The angle was clear. Mark's porch. Sydney stepping toward her car. Mark's sudden reappearance. His hand closing around her wrist. The pull. The pause. Sydney's stillness. No audio was needed. "That's enough," Sydney said quietly. Ethan stopped the video. "It corroborates everything." That afternoon, Ethan submitted the final evidentiary packet. By evening, Mark's attorney called him, voice low, strained. "They have witness testimony," the attorney said. "Video. Medical documentation. Financial records." Mark laughed weakly. "That doesn't prove intent." "It proves a pattern," the attorney replied. "And patterns don't need intent." Mark hung up without responding. He stared at the wall, replaying moments he'd dismissed as insignificant. The neighbor's quiet stare. Sydney's calm refusals. Her silence. He had mistaken stillness for surrender. The next day, the hearing convened. Sydney entered the courthouse with Ethan at her side. Lena waited nearby, offering a brief nod of reassurance. Sydney returned it with a small, steady smile. Mark sat across the room, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. The confidence he once wore like armor had thinned to something brittle and sharp. The judge took the bench. Proceedings began. Ethan presented the evidence without embellishment. He let documents speak, let timelines align, let patterns emerge. Mrs. Carol Whitman testified first. "I noticed things over time," she said calmly. "Raised voices, tension. And that morning I saw him grab her." "Did she resist?" the opposing counsel asked. Mrs. Whitman's gaze was steady. She didn't need to. She looked done. The courtroom stilled. Dr. Helena Wright followed. She described the injuries clinically, the documentation process, the consistency of Sydney's account. There was no confusion, Dr. Wright said. No exaggeration, just facts. When it was Sydney's turn, she stood without hesitation. She spoke only when asked. Yes, no, that is correct. When the judge asked her directly why she had waited to come forward, Sydney answered simply, "I wasn't ready to be believed," she said. "Now I am." The judge nodded, expression unreadable. Then came Lucas Reed. He looked smaller than Sydney remembered, creased, tired, his confidence gone. "I authorized the transactions," he admitted, "at Mr. Baker's request." "Why?" the judge asked. Lucas swallowed. "Because I was afraid of losing my job." The courtroom absorbed that quietly. Mark stared straight ahead. When the judge finally addressed him, Mark rose slowly, his movements stiff. "Do you have anything to add?" the judge asked. Mark opened his mouth, closed it. He glanced at Sydney, really looked at her for the first time in months. She met his gaze without anger, without triumph, just resolve. "No," Mark said hoarsely. "Nothing." The ruling followed swiftly. The protective order was upheld and expanded. Financial restitution was ordered pending further proceedings. Evidence was referred for additional review. The gavel struck once. It was done. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited. Reporters murmured. Ethan guided Sydney past them without comment. "Do you want to say anything?" one called. Sydney paused. She turned just enough to be seen, but not surrounded. "I hope anyone watching understands this," she said calmly. "Silence doesn't mean consent. It means survival, and survival deserves protection." She turned and walked away. That evening, Mark sat alone in his apartment, the ruling echoing in his mind. His phone lay silent now, not with relief, but with finality. He poured another drink. It tasted like nothing. Across the city, Sydney sat at Lena's kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The quiet felt different now, not tense, not watchful, just quiet. Lena broke the silence. "How does it feel?" Sydney considered the question. "Finished," she said. "And unfinished." Lena smiled softly. "That sounds like healing." Sydney looked out the window, the city lights steady and distant. She didn't feel victorious. She felt free of something heavy she'd carried too long. The truth had locked into place, not with noise, but with weight. And for the first time since the night everything changed. Sydney Baker knew the ground beneath her was solid. The judgment did not arrive like thunder. It came in envelopes, court notices, and signatures placed carefully at the bottom of pages that carried weight far beyond their ink. Consequences unfolded the way systems always did, methodical, impersonal, irreversible. Mark Baker learned that quickly. Within days of the hearing, his accounts were frozen pending review. Credit cards declined. Automatic payments failed. The house he once considered untouchable became an asset under scrutiny rather than a sanctuary. Letters from attorneys replaced invitations. Silence replaced influence. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would recover. But the world had stopped responding to his version of events. At the final financial settlement meeting, Mark sat across from Sydney for the first time since the courthouse steps. The room was neutral white walls, a long table, no windows. Nothing to distract from reality. Ethan Cross sat beside Sydney, documents arranged neatly in front of him. Mark's new attorney flipped through papers with tight efficiency, offering quiet reminders that no longer carried confidence. The mediator spoke in an even tone, outlining the terms. Asset division, restitution, restrictions. Sydney listened without reaction, her hands folded, her posture steady. She didn't look at Mark. She didn't need to. When the mediator paused, Mark spoke. "This is excessive," he said hoarsely. "She's taking everything." Ethan responded before Sydney could. "She's reclaiming what was taken." The mediator nodded and continued. Mark's voice cracked. "You don't understand what this does to me." Sydney looked up then, not with anger, not with satisfaction. "I understand exactly what it does," she said calmly. "I lived it." Silence followed. The agreement was signed. Mark's pen hovered before the final signature, his hand shaking. For a moment, Sydney wondered if he would refuse, if he would force another delay, another confrontation. He didn't. The pen touched paper. It was over. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, as if the world had moved on without waiting. Sydney stood on the courthouse steps and inhaled deeply. The air felt different when it wasn't laced with fear. Ethan gathered his files. "This resolves the civil matters," he said. "The rest will proceed without your involvement." Sydney nodded. "Thank you." Ethan hesitated. "What you did, how you did it, that matters." She met his gaze. "It mattered to me." Across town, Mark returned to his apartment, temporary now, rented, stripped of permanence. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his phone, scrolling through contacts he no longer felt entitled to call. Haley Brooks's name hovered on the screen. He deleted it. News of the settlement spread quietly through circles that once welcomed him. Invitations stopped. Messages went unanswered. The performance had ended, and no encore was coming. Mark poured himself a drink and stopped halfway through. The glass shook in his hand. He set it down. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be alone. Sydney, meanwhile, began the process of rebuilding not in grand gestures, but in choices. She moved into a small apartment across town, sunlight spilling across clean floors that held no echoes. She chose furniture slowly, deliberately, nothing that reminded her of before. On the first morning there, she woke without an alarm. The silence didn't feel dangerous. It felt earned. She returned to work full-time, her presence steady, her focus sharp. Colleagues treated her with quiet respect, not pity, not curiosity, just professionalism. Dr. Helena Wright stopped by her office one afternoon. "You're doing well," she said. Sydney smiled faintly. "I am." "Have you thought about speaking?" Dr. Wright asked. "About what you went through?" Sydney considered it. "Yes, but not yet. Whenever you're ready," Dr. Wright said. "Your voice would help people." That evening, Sydney met Lena for dinner. "You look different," Lena said, studying her. "I feel different," Sydney replied. Lighter, Sydney nodded. Stronger. They talked about small things, work, weekend plans, recipes. Normal life returning gently. Later, alone in her apartment, Sydney unpacked the last box. At the bottom, she found the silk scarf. She held it for a moment, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer, not hidden, not discarded. A reminder of where she'd been, not where she was going. The final notice arrived a week later. Mark Baker had been formally charged with financial misconduct, pending further investigation. Sydney read the letter once. Then she set it aside. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt closure. That night, she cooked dinner for herself, simple, warm, nourishing. She ate at the small table by the window, city lights glowing softly beyond the glass. No one criticized the meal. No one demanded a smile. Afterward, she washed the dishes slowly, deliberately aware of the quiet rhythm of her own breath. This was peace. Across town, Mark sat in his apartment staring at walls that no longer answered to him. The control he'd relied on had evaporated, not through confrontation, but through consequence. He reached for his phone, then stopped. There was no one left to intimidate. Sydney stood by her window, the night open before her. She didn't think about Mark anymore, not with weight, not with anger. She thought about tomorrow, and the day after that, and the life that had finally begun to feel like her own. Sydney Baker's life did not reset overnight. It recalibrated quietly, deliberately, like a compass finally freed from a magnetic pull. The mornings were the first to change. In her new apartment, dawn arrived gently through wide windows, light touching the walls without asking permission. Sydney woke without flinching, without rehearsing excuses in her head. There was no need to measure her movements, no need to anticipate another person's mood before her feet touched the floor. She made breakfast slowly, not as an offering, not as a performance, as nourishment. Some days it was eggs and toast, other days just fruit and coffee. The choice itself felt radical. She ate at the small table by the window, watching the city stretch awake, aware of her own breathing, her own pace. No one corrected her. No one demanded anything. At work, she stepped into her role with a steadiness that surprised even her. The clinic felt familiar again, not as a refuge, but as a place where she was competent, respected whole. Patients responded to her calm presence. Colleagues trusted her instincts. Dr. Helena Wright noticed the shift. "You're carrying yourself differently," she said one afternoon as they walked the hallway. Sydney considered the words. "I'm not carrying what isn't mine anymore." Dr. Wright smiled. "That shows." Outside of work, Sydney began reclaiming pieces of herself she hadn't realized she'd set aside. She signed up for a weekend class, not because it was useful, but because it sounded interesting. She walked through bookstores without checking the time. She said no when she wanted to, yes when she meant it. With Lena, the conversations changed too. They laughed more. They talked about the future without hedging every sentence. They made plans that didn't revolve around safety strategies or exit routes. One evening, as they sat on Sydney's balcony watching the city lights come on, Lena asked, "Do you ever think about him?" Sydney didn't answer right away. "Not the way I used to," she said finally. "He doesn't live in my body anymore." Lena nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The legal matters resolved themselves without requiring Sydney's presence. Emails arrived. Notices closed, processes concluded. Each one felt like a door shutting softly somewhere far away. Mark Baker's name became less frequent in her thoughts, then rare, then irrelevant. What remained were lessons. Sydney didn't romanticize what she'd endured. She didn't reframe it as necessary pain or growth by force. She understood it for what it was: survival under constraint. But she also understood what came after. Strength, she realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't reactive. It wasn't cruel. Strength was choosing clarity over chaos, documentation over drama, boundaries over explanations. It was knowing when to be silent and when silence had done its work. Months later, Dr. Wright approached her again. "There's a small group forming," she said, "staff-led, support and resources for patients experiencing domestic instability. I thought of you." Sydney felt the weight of the offer and its meaning. "Yes," she said, "I'd like to help." She didn't tell her story in graphic detail. She didn't position herself as a symbol. She spoke about systems, about documentation, about safety planning, about believing patterns before they escalated. People listened, not because she demanded it, but because her calm carried authority. On the first anniversary of her move, Sydney hosted a quiet dinner in her apartment. Lena came, a couple of co-workers, no speeches, no toasts about survival. Just food, laughter, presence. After everyone left, Sydney stood alone in the kitchen, washing dishes, the rhythm soothing. She caught her reflection in the window, older perhaps, but clearer. She thought back to that morning long ago. The bruise, the scarf, the breakfast served under fear. She smiled, not with bitterness, not with triumph, with gratitude for the woman who had stayed steady long enough to get here. Sydney dried her hands and turned off the light. The apartment settled into silence, not the heavy kind, not the dangerous kind, the peaceful kind. She went to bed knowing exactly who she was. Not someone who endured quietly because she was weak, but someone who waited, observed, documented, and chose her moment. Someone who understood that justice didn't always arrive loudly, but when it did, It could be final. And healing didn't erase the past. It put it in its proper place. Sydney Baker closed her eyes, the city humming softly beyond the glass. Tomorrow would come, and she would meet it unbruised, unafraid, and entirely her own. What Sydney's story reminds us is this strength does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience, like preparation, like refusing to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. In real life, many forms of injustice survive, not because they are invisible, but because they are normalized. Because silence is mistaken for consent. Because endurance is confused with acceptance. Sydney didn't win by shouting louder. She didn't win by humiliating anyone. She won by telling the truth to the right systems at the right time, with evidence that could not be ignored. And then this matters, she chose healing. She didn't let justice turn into bitterness. She didn't let survival harden into hate. She let the chapter close. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect, where in your life are you being quiet? Not because you're weak, but because you're preparing. Where might clarity be more powerful than reaction? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is there. We read every message, and if you believe stories like this can help someone feel less alone, less crazy, less trapped, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Some stories don't just entertain. They remind us who we are.